Well, ladies and gentlemen, on Thursday night, I gave a very short biographical introduction to our speaker, Ian Stevenson. That was at his request. This morning, I am going to give a somewhat longer one, but it is not going to be a conventional biographical introduction. Instead, I am going to focus on one fact in Dr. Stevenson's life, and I'm going to draw some speculative conclusions from that fact. Now, Dr. Stevenson is a scientist, so he is concerned with facts, right? I, alas, am an irresponsible humanist. And so I am concerned with speculation. So I hope that Dr. Stevenson will forgive my speculation this morning. Now, the fact I'm going to start with pertains to his education. Dr. Stevenson, Ian Stevenson, he wasn't a doctor then, you were not born a doctor. Ian Stevenson was born in Canada, and his family were of Scottish extraction. So when he came to go to university, he went back to Scotland, and he went to the University of St. Andrews, where he got his bachelor's degree. Now, that's the fact I want to talk about. Here's the speculation. Universities are called, particularly one's undergraduate university, is called one's alma mater, one's dear mother. And dear mother universities have an effect on the people who are associated with them, which is not unlike one's biological mother. There's a kind of imprinting which is made. I want to point out to you three facts about St. Andrews University, which I think have some effect, whether consciously or unconsciously, whether objectively or subliminally, on Ian Stevenson. The first fact is that this all comes as a surprise to him. He had no idea I was going to do this. The first fact is that in the 19th century, there was associated with St. Andrews University a very distinguished scholar who was an anthropologist, a folklorist, and a literary man by the name of Andrew Lang. Now, that name may not mean anything to most of you, but Andrew Lang went all over the British Isles collecting folklore. And then he wrote up that folklore in a form suitable for children, and a series of books were published based on them, which are known as the Rainbow Books. There was the Red Book of Fairy Tales, the Yellow Book of Fairy Tales, the Green Book of Fairy Tales, the Blue Book of Fairy Tales, etc., etc., etc. I grew up on Andrew Lang's Rainbow Books of Fairy Tales, and I expect some of you did too. All right, now, what has that got to do with anything? Well, second fact. In the early 20th century, in the 1920s, a distinguished scholar from Oxford went to St. Andrews University, which had established a special lectureship called the Andrew Lang Lecture. And this distinguished scholar from Oxford gave the Andrew Lang Lecture one year, and his subject for the lecture was On the Fairy Story. And the name of that distinguished scholar was J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, in that lecture, Tolkien defined what is the essence of a fairy story from his standpoint. And in fact, he outlined the characteristics of the fairy story, which corresponded with a series of fairy stories he already had written in his mind, although they were not to be published until many years later, and we know them as The Lord of the Rings. Right? Now, Tolkien said that the basic characteristic of a fairy story, or one of the basic characteristics, is that it has a happy ending. How do all fairy stories end? And they all lived happily ever after, right? Now, Tolkien contrasted the fairy story with another literary genre, namely the tragedy. And what is the characteristic of all tragedies? Well, Aristotle told us it is that they have a catastrophe. Now, catastrophe is actually a Greek word meaning a turning point. But the turning point is, in the tragedy, that the central character, the protagonist, is killed or destroyed, demolished. Right? So that all tragedies end that way. Now, Tolkien said that the opposite of the tragedy is the fairy story, which has always a happy ending. Of course, being a scholar, Tolkien couldn't say that fairy stories have a happy ending. After all, happy ending is something everybody understands, a term everybody understands. And scholars have to use terms that nobody understands. or else you suppose that they don't know anything more than you do. So Tolkien invented a term from Greek, and his term was eucatastrophe, which means literally a good turning. So all fairy stories end with a good turning at the end. Now the question is, and this is a question Tolkien asked, what is life? Is it a tragedy with a catastrophic ending? Or is it a fairy story with a eucatastrophe and a happy ending? That's a fundamental question in life. And it's a question all human beings, whether they are aware of it or not, ponder. Now, the third fact relating to the University of St. Andrews. The University of St. Andrews has one college which has a motto which is carved on a stone entrance, a stone archway at the college. And that motto is written in Middle Scots, and I won't attempt to say it in Middle Scots, but in contemporary English it is, "They have said." What say they? Let them say. Now that motto happened to be very close to me because for 10 years I edited an academic journal, the American Speech, which was the Journal of the American Dialect Society. It was founded in 1926, the same year as the Theosophical Society moved here. And it was founded by 3 very distinguished American academics, plus a Baltimore newspaper man named H.L. Mencken. And when that journal was founded, it took as its motto this motto of the college at St. Andrews University. I don't know why, but it did. Now that motto is kind of oracular. You can interpret it in different ways. But I believe the sense that the motto had originally was something like this. They have said there are many opinions about many things throughout society. What say they? We need to be aware of what those opinions are. Let them say. We must not be bound by opinions, right? I think that, and in fact, that interpretation of that motto comes very close to being the same thing as the motto of the Theosophical Society. The motto of the Theosophical Society was borrowed from the motto of the Maharaja of Benares. And it's a Sanskrit motto, Satya Nasti Parodharma. And the society translates that as there is no religion higher than truth. But in fact, you cannot translate that motto into English easily because several words, particularly the word dharma, has meanings that we have no English word for. So a paraphrase of the motto, which I think captures more or less accurately its basic meaning, is the opinions of humanity on any subject do not exhaust the reality of that subject. Or to put the words to use Hamlet's words at the beginning of Shakespeare's play, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Why am I taking up so much of Dr. Stevenson's valuable time to tell you this? My speculation. Dr. Stevenson's career has been to study facts, particularly about survival after death, right? A subject we are all interested in. What is the dominant view in our time and in our society on that subject? Well, the dominant view of scientists is that there ain't nothing, right? That's it. Dr. Stevenson has said, in effect, what say they? They have said, what say they? Let them say. Let's look at the facts to see what we can find. And what are the facts? Is life a tragedy ending with the catastrophe of death? Or is life a fairy tale with a eucatastrophic ending, a happy ending, with something that goes on beyond it? That, I would suggest, is the subject of Dr. Stevenson's remarks this morning in this survey. So without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to present Dr. Ian Stevenson, talking on the subject, Evidence for Life After Death.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aljo. I could almost prefer to listen to him than to hear what I'm going to say.
However, I'm only speculation. He's fact.
Well, I'm to talk about evidence for life after death, and I'm going to stay away from children who claim to remember past lives. And I think it's important to understand that there are other kinds of evidence additional to those provided by the children. There are at least 6 sources of evidence for life after death, and I'm going to try to touch on each of these. I'll tell you in advance what they are. The first and possibly the most important are apparitions, sometimes called hallucinations of the mentally well. And then there are experiences of persons who come close to death and survive. They have attracted considerable popular interest in recent years. Then there are experiences of people who come close to death and die and make various statements that deserve attention just before they die. Then there are experiences that are best described as possession, in which a person's personality, the characteristics by which we ordinarily identify a person as a separate person, become abolished and replaced by the characteristics of another person. And then there are experiences that we describe as mediumship, in which a particular person seems to have the gift of bringing credible communications from persons who have died and who are presumed to have survived death, and we may call them discarnate personalities. There are also dreams, and I think this afternoon I want to tell you about some vivid dreams experienced by a colleague of mine that I think provide some additional evidence for life after death. Well, let's go back to apparitions and start by my reminding you that they're really quite common. That surveys have shown, and some of these surveys go back to the late 19th century, others are more recent, they show that between 10 and 27% in one series of ordinary people like ourselves have become aware in some way, usually visually, but perhaps through some other senses, of a discarnate person or persons. Some of these surveys have focused on particular people, particular groups of people, I should say. One very notable one that created quite a stir among my colleagues in medicine about 15 years ago was conducted by general practitioner in the United Kingdom, and he wrote a paper called The Hallucinations of the Bereaved. And he surveyed widows and widowers, and he found that as many as 25% of them believed that they had had some kind of experience of a spouse who had died. Now, not all of these by any means were visual apparitions. Some consisted only of a strong sense of presence. Others went into further detail, and perhaps a widow might have an hallucination of a characteristic cigar that her husband had smoked and be convinced that he was somehow communicating with her in this way. The apparitional experiences that are visual are very commonly associated with death, and the circumstances of death are sometimes communicated by the apparitional figure. Here's a typical case reported by the Society for Psychical Research. An officer, an army officer in London, is sleeping and suddenly wakes up and sees a fellow officer who he was sure was in South Africa in the army fighting there. This was during the time of the so-called First Boer War, when the British undertook to subdue the Transvaal, which was occupied by the Dutch farmers, the Boers. The apparition startled the percipient, and then it said, "I'm shot." The percipient said, "Shot? Good God, when and where?" The apparition then said, "In the lungs," and he slowly lifted his right hand and raised it up until it came to the right chest, and then he disappeared. It was possible for the percipient to, as he was an army officer himself, to communicate with the military authorities, and he learned that the person whose apparition he saw had in fact been shot in the right chest. So that was a veridical apparition. Veridical meaning that the apparition included features that corresponded to ascertainable facts. There have been many cases of that sort, and they commonly occur, as I've said, in relation to an unexpected and violent death. Why is that? Some have said that that's because death is memorable and people simply hang on to memories of death, and death itself doesn't have anything to do with the occurrence of apparitions. And that's been rather thoroughly studied, and it seems more likely than not that death itself, especially a violent death, somehow facilitates the occurrence of these apparitional experiences. Now I'll tell you about another apparitional experience. It also has to do with death. This occurred in Scotland. It was first described by the percipient, who had some reputation in Scotland and elsewhere for what the Scottish call second sight, which is particularly common in the Highlands. But second sight usually involves the perception of someone just before they die. It's regarded as a kind of premonition. Or it may be that person is seen just after death, but the death is not known to the percipient. And that was true in the case that I'm about to describe. In this case, the percipient, who, as I said, had some reputation for paranormal powers, she was coming out of her house to collect milk bottles. That dates it, doesn't it? It shows that milk was still being delivered in the 1930s when she had this experience. So she was going outside her door, and she saw a neighbor walking down the street. And she picked up the milk bottles, went in, and said to her husband, I see the McKays are back. He didn't think much about it. And about half an hour later, a man came to the door and asked to speak to her husband. And they conferred for a few minutes. And then this man, it turned out, was an employee of the factory where the apparitional figure, as it now appeared, had been foreman, and said that they had just received news that he died. And where had he died? He died in a town of northern England where he and his wife had been on vacation. How about the clothing? The percipient saw this man dressed in a cotton shirt and flannel trousers, and she had him under observation for at least 10 seconds because she could see him emerging from behind their house and walking down toward the factory where he worked. How was he dressed when he died? He was not dressed at all. He was stark naked. He had the custom of sleeping naked, and that was his way. That morning, he had awakened with some unease and felt some discomfort, and his wife had given him a mild analgesic, and he'd apparently gone back to sleep. She went to rouse him a little later and could not do so, found that he had died. What was the time interval between his death in England and the apparitional experience in Scotland? It was probably a couple of hours. I did obtain a death certificate, and it showed that he had died of what are sometimes called coronary sclerosis. That's more often now spoken of as a heart attack, but it sometimes carries off the victims suddenly. I went to the site of this apparition twice. I wasn't sure that I was sufficiently familiar with it after my first visit, and I went back and walked along the route, so to speak, and talked with the widow of the deceased man, and became fully impressed by the fact that this percipient had seen this friend at a time when she could not have known that he had died just an hour or two before. considerable number of these experiences are what we call collective. And by that we mean that if two or more persons are present, then the apparitional figure will be seen by more than one person. And if that's the case, that is, if there are two or more persons present, then in about a third of the cases, more than one person has the experience. Well, that suggests, of course, that some persons are more sensitive than others. And going back to the surveys, and some of the surveys, if one paranormal experience is claimed, then the respondent to the survey very commonly, in about at least 30% of the cases, says that he or she has had other experiences of the same or a different type. I think one of my messages today is to impress on you, if you need impressing, with the frequency of these experiences. And it's unfortunate that they're not better known and not more adequately studied. I mentioned the surveys, but the surveys didn't penetrate very much into the circumstances of the experiences. And in the second half of the 20th century, there were very few reports of apparitional experiences published. I became interested in that, and that was one stimulus for my own endeavor, that I put together a paper recording 6 what I call modern apparitional experiences. And these were all experiences, I've mentioned one of them, these were all experiences known to friends or colleagues of mine, and they told them to me. But very often they had not been told to other people, or very little. And sometimes the recipients had been advised, or more abruptly told, not to talk about such things. And so they didn't. I think that's one reason why they're so little known and so little studied. Well, I've run dry on talking about apparitions, so let me open this now to any questions you may have about them. Yes, sir.
Dr. Stevenson, all of the examples you gave suggest some sort of paranormal experience between a sender and a receiver, but none of them sound like they're necessarily after-death experiences.
They don't sound, let me see.
They're after-death experiences. In other words, I can imagine from the examples you gave that these apparitions were with people that were maybe near death, but they hadn't necessarily died yet. Am I missing something?
May I
Oh, yeah,
the recording in the sake of the audience who won't have heard your question. Let me repeat the questions for the virtual audience. The question is, in the accounts of apparitions which Dr. Stevenson has made, it is not clear whether the person behind the apparition had died yet or not. And he wants to know whether or not you can comment on that that apparent conclusion he has drawn.
That's a very good point. But I think in the case of the soldier who was shot in the chest in the 1880s, In those days, a shot through the lungs would have been quickly fatal, and I think he must have been dead when he appeared, but it would be impossible to ascertain the exact time, and it was in a battle. The time of the percipient, of course, was well known and recorded. In the Scottish case, again, we can't be sure. It may be that the appearing figure, was communicating just as he was dying. The timing was very close, it'd be about 2 hours. And it's, I was trying to think of an irrefutable case, and right now I can't. I think there may be such cases. It's certainly true that they occur very close to death. Yeah.
Well, I second-hand could report, not a visual case, but I worked with an electrician, and his sister died. And he was very angry that he didn't get to say goodbye. I worked with an electrician, and his sister died, and he was very angry he didn't get to say goodbye. So he called her on the phone and got her voice on the answering machine. The next day he called, and the husband says, "We don't have an answering machine."
That sounds like a technical innovation.
That's what this gentleman reported, and he could say he got the wrong number and had a hallucination or something, but a few years ago, when the Noetic Sciences had their on human survival of death, there was one session on aberrations with electronic devices.
Yes. Yes, I've heard of those.
I'll speak to something very similar that happened to me. I used to work as a hospice nurse, and I had one lady that I was on call, and she was close to death, and my cell phone rang about 1 o'clock in the morning. I was at home, and it rang with a ringer that I'd never heard before, and private number came up on the machine there. When I answered it, nobody was there, so I hung up. Went to bed. 5 minutes later, I got a call from the nursing home. Enid just died. So I really felt that that was her calling to tell me she was leaving.
Yes, yeah. Yes.
A case in my family is where my father-in-law had a very close friend, and he died, and they went to the memorial service or the funeral, and when they came back to their house, his friend was sitting in the chair where he normally sat when he visited. He was just sitting there. He didn't say anything. And I said to my father-in-law, he told me the story many times, I said, "Are you really sure of that? Didn't you imagine it?" And he said, "I saw him as clear as he was alive." And it was after the funeral, or after the memorial service.
Somebody.
This happened when I was very young. I remember I think about 5 years old, and at the time I shared a bedroom with my brother, which was very common. And I had two older sisters that shared another bedroom, and it was very early in the morning, and I woke up and I saw a beautiful lady dressed in, I'm guessing about 5 years old, but she was wearing a pink dress, a long pink dress, which I thought was very pretty. And she was standing at the opening to the bedroom, to our bedroom, and she was kind of waving. She wasn't speaking, but she was waving at me I thought to follow her, and I didn't think anything of it. And I did follow her out the bedroom into our kitchen, and then she walked around the stove, she went into the bathroom, and I didn't follow her there because you don't go into the bathroom when someone else is there. And I heard, but she didn't close the door, and I didn't see her feet. I saw the dress, the flowing dress, but I didn't notice feet. And the toilet flushed, not she flushed the toilet, but the toilet flushed, and then I waited for her to come out, and when she didn't come out, I looked, I thought, oh, I hope I don't get in trouble, but I looked, and there was no one there. And it was on a Saturday morning, so when my mother got up, I said, Mom, I told her what I had seen, this lady in this pink dress, and she said, tell me what this dress looks like, and I said, it was a beautiful pink dress. It was a pretty pink gown. It was a gown. And that's, I don't remember what else I might have described, but it was my mother's sister who had passed away, and they had buried her in a long pink dress. And that's pretty much all I remember. My mother is gone now.
Yeah.
Since you mentioned a correlation between violent death and apparitions, the occurrence of apparitions, I wondered if you'd communicated with any of the 9/11 survivors and had anything to share on that event.
Have you had any contact with 9/11?
No, I haven't. No.
I have one more. Yeah, this is the last.
There is a physician out of Houston area who has been working as a hospice physician, has written a book, and in that she has made a comment that people who die violent death or sudden deaths often see the whole life kind of going by, as opposed to people who are dying slow or chronic death, where they seem to be even visited by their relatives who have died before them. Any comment about?
There have been reports of people, particularly who die a sudden death, experiencing a flashback vision of their whole life as they are dying, and sometimes also are greeted by relatives or people they have known who have died earlier. Do you have any comment on this?
Yes, I was going to come to that topic later, but that is an important topic. Any other questions? Well, all right, let's go on to the next topic, which is the visions of persons who are just about to die. One of the most impressive cases of this kind that I've investigated was sent to me first in a letter from the recipient, who was caring for her grandfather, step-grandfather more accurately. He was dying and had been so much weakened by his illness, which was serious fatal leukemia, that he was going to be taken to the hospital. And it happened that the recipient, in this case, was caring for him in their home, pending assistance in helping him into the ambulance that was going to take the patient to the hospital. And so she was alone and expecting later in the day other members of the family to return, but they were not there at the time. She heard her step-grandfather calling out for help, and then she heard him calling, "Hazel, Hazel." And she went back to his room and tried to lift him up and give him a drink of water, but she was too weak to raise him, and so she left him alone, and he continued calling her, calling Hazel, Hazel, and she tried to telephone for help to her mother, who was at work, and the mother said, "Well, we can't help you now. Your stepfather won't be home until later, and there's nothing. You'll just have to do whatever you can to help your step-grandfather as much as you can." And so she went back to the room where the dying man was and found that it was brilliantly lit. It was full of light. And the step-grandfather was sitting up with his arms held out in front of him as if he were going to embrace someone. And then the percipient in this case saw that his wife was actually there. And illuminated by the light, she was elevated somewhat. She could not, that is, she, the percipient in this case, could not see the feet. It seemed as if she just saw the upper half of the body of the wife of the dying man, and the brilliant light, and the most impressive feature for her was the extraordinary beatitude, the peacefulness, the tranquility, the happy smile on the face of both the dying man and the appearing figure of his wife. The dying man had, although helpless 10 minutes before, he had actually managed to sit up and extend his arms toward, as he believed, his wife. And the recipient who wrote me about the experience was quite clear that she had recognized the wife of the dying man. And after a moment, he just sank back. The apparition vanished. So that's a kind of experience that occurs more often than is generally realized, and it's commonplace to, that seems a little strong. Not uncommon, I think, is a nicer word here, to learn from hospice nurses and caregivers of the dying that they have witnessed some experience of this kind. I corresponded with the recipient in this case, and then traveled to the town where she was living. The experience had happened many years before. I had forgotten now how she got our name, but she did somehow and wrote me about it. And I pursued it as well as I could. A book has been written by two nurses. and they report experiences of this kind. An entire book was written by Sir William Barrett, who is one of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research in the 1880s. His book is called Deathbed Visions, and he collected a large number of these cases. His wife was a doctor, and she had an opportunity to learn about experiences of this kind. I think they're much more common than we realize, and we are now, in our little research unit, we're trying to approach the hospice workers to inform us about such experiences, and maybe interview persons who are witnesses of them. It's not easy to investigate these cases. Understandably, death is a private matter with family members, and they may not want the intrusion of investigators, least of all scientists, who may be thought of as more skeptical than they are. But nevertheless, we do welcome reports of experiences like that and take them very seriously. Not many of them have veridical features, but a few do. And soon after I went to Virginia, I learned of one, but I was too young and uninformed to investigate it thoroughly. However, I'll narrate it. It was told to me by a minister of one of the local churches in Charlottesville, who came to call on me, and not surprisingly, the conversation turned to paranormal phenomena, and he told me about the death of his grandmother. As she was dying, she seemed to brighten up, and she said, "Oh, Will, are you there?" And nobody attending her had any idea about Will. They'd never heard of a Will. And soon after making this unexpected remark, she died. And then some weeks later, it was learned that she had a brother. Her death occurred in the United States. The brother was in England, and apparently unknown to members of her family, whether through some ill will or not, I don't know, but he was not known to the people present. They'd asked among themselves, who's Will? Where is Will? What is Will? Who is Will? At any rate, to get to the point, they learned that the woman who had just died and who had said that Will was there, she had a brother in England, and he had died just 2 days before she did. Now that's the kind of case that nowadays we would try to investigate more thoroughly with an understanding of dates, and we could have had precise dates, but as I said, I was a beginner then, and all I did was listen and make notes.
The following program was produced by the Theosophical Society in America.
Where we interrupted, and I think we had a hand up before the break, so let's get a microphone.
My question is related to the case about the step-grandfather and the case of Hazel. It's a two-part question. My first question was, did you discover how long since Hazel had passed away herself? And with relation to the near-death bed apparition experiences, did you discover a common thread? This is the second part. A common thread like fear of death in the individual who was near death, or perhaps a particular illness that many of them had, or perhaps the age of the individual dying. Were there common threads that would link these near-death experiences? And then the first part was how many years or months before had Hazel passed away in that case?
Hazel had passed away many years before. A dying person had quarreled with a member of the family, not Hazel. He had a happy marriage. But so the percipient, when she heard the step-grandfather calling for help, had some idea that he wanted help in perhaps meeting this relative with whom he'd quarreled and making it up. Many dying people do wish to heal any wounds that may be persisting, but that wasn't apparently the case here. As to ages, they vary a lot. Some of these cases have occurred among quite young children. I believe Sir William Barrett's book, which may still be in print on deathbed visions, has some instances of children having such experiences. Yeah.
Do you want to?
Well, all I was going to say is I was wondering about...
Into the microphone, please.
Oh, I was wondering about auditory things happening when people die, because before my mother died, she was staying with me, and I had this Technicolor dream. It was a small autopsy amphitheater, and they were doing an autopsy on her, and all I remember now is the color green, a very lovely green. And then soon after, it was the night before she died, she was saying to me, "Who are all those people?" As if there was a gathering of people. I was new to all this, so I didn't know what was happening. By morning, she had passed on, and then I guess it was soon after the funeral, either that night or the night after, I was going to sleep, and I seemed to be sinking into a kind of a dark well, as if I was going to pass out, and I heard her call my name, Marge, and I kind of came to with a shock, my heart beating, and that was that. But for 2 or 3 years after that, fairly often, friends I knew would call me by her name, Dorothy, and then they'd say, "Oh, no, you're Marjorie," and I don't know how that ties in, but the idea of someone calling you by name like that, and if other people have had that experience.
I don't know how to answer that question about the frequency of names.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Stevenson, one of the things that helps me understand the person who does research such as yours is to really better understand your life. Specifically, could you comment on 3 aspects of your life? The first, what brought you to this kind of work? Secondly, what are your personal beliefs regarding life after death? And thirdly, have you had any experiences that are similar to the ones that you've researched?
I don't know the answer to the first question. I really don't. The second question I decline to answer because I think it's important for everyone to make up their minds for themselves. And authority is the enemy of science. And scientists' personal beliefs should never influence anyone. I'm sorry, I've forgotten your third question.
Have you had any experiences like these?
Yes, I've had one or two minor experiences.
Thank you. I wonder, Dr. Stevenson, if you would comment on your view of the book written by Osis and Haraldson on deathbed visions, where they compared U.S. with, I believe, people from India, and found, I believe they concluded that the experiences were substantially the same, although, of course, they reflected cultural differences, but there were some essential similarities between deathbed visions in the two very different cultures. And I'm trusting that you're familiar with the book and wonder what your view of it is from a scientific perspective, kind of a critical scientific perspective.
Would you repeat the name of the book or of the authors?
Actually, I can't remember the name, but the authors are Carlos Osis and Erlander Haraldson.
I'm not familiar with that book.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
I've not studied deathbed visions except in the West, so I don't know about differences between the Western experiences and those that Asians would have. There are differences in the experiences of persons who come close to death and survive, and we'll talk about that perhaps this afternoon.
Yes. Have you ever been able to document any cases of people who had horrific deathbed experiences, seen visions that frightened or terrified them?
No, I don't think so. I've heard of such. Louis XI, the King of France, was in some ways a dreadful person. Although he was in some other respects the founder of modern France. But his death was just terrible. There are records of his tormenting days as he was dying, and apparently included a great deal of repentance for his wicked behavior.
Dr. Stevenson, Dr. Algio mentioned that he was the humanist and you're the scientist, and that there's this issue of facts versus observation, and also mentioned that science basically doesn't believe in life after death. And so in a certain sense, you're an anachronism. That is, you're a man, I don't know any other man who spent more of his time and done such beautiful work trying to prove the existence of life after death, and yet you're working in a scientific way. And have you ever, how do you feel, what do you think is the present situation here where you have done purely scientific work? You've never taken a religious or philosophical position on this. So you've done this all scientifically, yet you're in a field where all your colleagues believe what you're doing is not important. And do you feel that you have been fighting against what I would call a scientific bias all your lifetime, that it's almost as if you can never prove, and that science will never accept anything that you've ever done, or your colleagues in the same area that are working with you, do you feel that? Do you feel that the present position which science takes is not legitimate? I mean, if science says life does not exist, once we die, we're dead, and that's it, we're dust. Do you feel that that is scientifically correct to say that in an absolute sense?
Well, I think the most important point is that scientists are just members of a club who have got together for particular endeavors in which they may share. At the current position in science, although it does seem to be rigidly fixed, it changes. I mean, you just have to think of a little of the history of science to realize how much it has changed. Think, for example, of the struggle to have the idea of evolution accepted by scientists. In the 18th century, Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles, conjectured that there might be some origin of species other than instant creation once and for all. But nothing came of that, and then a French scientist, Lamarck, put forward a substantial idea about evolution. And nothing much came of that. He was ridiculed by the leading French biologist, Cuvier, who was even cast aspersions on Lamarck at his funeral, which is taking hardness of view rather seriously. And then Charles Darwin had his idea. It took him 20 years to evolve a reasonable exposition of his ideas. And he encountered tremendous opposition, both from other scientists and from established clergymen. But nowadays, nearly all scientists believe in evolution. So science changes because scientists are mortal. They die. Max Planck said that you can't expect ideas to be changed quickly. You have to wait for the funerals.
Have you documented any research that has shown that animals can sense people that have been deceased, that have just recently died, that they can sense spirits, or that would you answer that one? Have you had any experience with that in your research?
One or two, yes. I'm a cat lover, and I've heard of one or two claims of reincarnation in cats. I remember studying a human case in Scotland, and this was in the Highlands, where, as I mentioned earlier, there's widespread belief in what they call second sight. And I interviewed at some length the mother of the subject, whom I later met. She was then grown up. This is a child who remembered previous life. And on the an immense cushion, there was an almost equally immense cat who slept, I should say, through the interview. And as a cat lover, I became interested in the cat. And so finally I inquired about the cat. And the mother of the student said that she was convinced this cat was her own grandfather reborn. No evidence.
If I could just add a comment along the original line. Well, my wife and I had a pair of cats. They were siblings, very, very close, grown up together, extremely close. The male cat developed an illness, and we had to take him off periodically to the vets and leave him overnight, and that was fine. The female sibling had no problem with any of that. Finally got to the place where the male cat had to be put down. He was in suffering, and there was no hope for him, so we sent him off for that. And the female cat, unlike all of the other times we had sent the male off to the vet, went into a state of severe decline. She refused to eat. My wife had to sort of feed her by hand. She looked as though she were grieving, as she knew that the male sibling was not coming back anymore. And it was just a very, very clear difference in the female's behavior on this occasion and all previous occasions when the male cat had been sent off. So, you know, for whatever that's worth, it seems to me that animals do have some kind of sense sometimes. We have one question back there and then up here again.
Dr. Stevenson, are you familiar with a book called Across Time and Space, where a woman recalls her just prior life in England and then goes there and finds her past life children who later actually accept her as their mother because she remembered details such as instances at their birthday or illnesses, etc., that only she would have been aware of?
What was the name of the book?
Across Time and Space. I can't recall the
Across Time and Space.
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Was there one up here?
Just to answer the previous question, didn't Lord Carnarvon's pet dog in England howl when he passed away in Cairo? I've read that several times, and I imagine it's documented.
Maybe.
Mm.
We have one in the back.
There.
Yeah, a general question. Have you any comments about what type of person may experience these apparitions? Are they more sensitive than others? And has there been any real serious research by anyone in that area?
I didn't get that.
So would you repeat the question for us? Sorry.
Would you say that there's a particular type of person who would be more apt to experience an apparition? Would he be more sensitive or not? Has anybody done any work in that area?
Is there any correlation between a personality type, or perhaps I would be interested in knowing belief, assumptions, and the experience of apparitions? Are some people more likely to experience apparitions than others? Has any work been done on that?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. One of the troubles, one of the difficulties is that one doesn't learn about these experiences except exceptionally, except rarely, until sometime after they've occurred. But that's a matter that should be investigated.
I really don't know, but the person who comes to my mind would be Carl Jung. Has he done any work in that area?
Carl Jung did any work in that area?
No, I don't think so.
I don't know of any.
I'm not aware of that.
Questions over here.
Just a comment on this gentleman's question. Hasn't Dr. Kenneth Ring done a study where he has taken about 100 of these cases and found that prior belief did not matter, personality did not matter, that the experiences really happened to all kinds of people? I think Dr. Kenneth Ring has written a book. What's the name again? I think there are 2 books he has written. The last one was called Heading Toward Omega. And then there is one book before where he actually has taken 100 cases and he actually has tried to show a statistical analysis of some of these cases.
What is the name of the author?
Kenneth Ring, R.I.
Kenneth Ring.
Yeah, the book that in which he did these cases, I forget the title, but the book following that was called Heading Toward Omega, where he was trying to synthesize all this material together.
Yeah.
Was it Life After Life?
Possibly, that might be it.
As a follow-up to the question on personality types, have you noticed that people of certain nationalities or races are more likely to have these experiences than others? For instance, are the Irish more likely to have such experiences, or the East Indians? Cultures, lifestyles.
Of course, there are claims of this sort, especially about the Scottish Highlands and the Irish. I studied a case in Hungary. That is, I studied it in Switzerland, but the people concerned were Hungarians. And the principal informant, the mother of the child, in fact, said that Central Europe, when she was talking about France and Germany and England, Holland, Belgium, all that block of countries that could be called Central Europe, had been dominated by the Christian religion, and that this had led to the suppression of reports of paranormal events, whereas countries on the periphery, such as Hungary and Finland and Iceland, had escaped from that dominance and therefore had more paranormal experiences. And I think that there may be some truth to that. Certainly, Finland has been a rich source of paranormal experiences to those who look for it. So has Iceland. I've been to both those countries. And so perhaps it's true that certain peoples are more sensitive than others. But there isn't much evidence on this. It's largely opinions, and of course it's naturally colored by nationalistic pride.
Or perhaps simply certain cultures encourage the reports of experiences, and it's hard to know whether the experiences are more frequent or less frequent. We have a question, Dr. Stevenson, from Atlanta, Georgia, from Brian James, who I might add is a descendant of William James.
Good ancestry.
The question is, do you have any comment on the skeptical or scientific view that deathbed visions are related to physiological processes taking place in the body of the dying person.
Yes, I think they must have. I think the mind becomes loosened from the brain, and that makes the dying person more sensitive to unusual experiences. It was notable and now largely forgotten, unknown English genius called Myers, who wrote a book, the anniversary of which just 2 years ago, 1 year ago, was published posthumously in 1903. It's called Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death. And he believed that scientists should take into their surveys all kinds of experiences that were then neglected, including apparitions, of course, and deathbed visions and experiences of dying people, and to some extent mediumship that deserved credence. But his book has been largely ignored by psychologists since then. Many people who might be better informed, you would hope, have never even heard of Myers. Two of my colleagues are now working on a book in which they're going to revive interest in Myers and in the extraordinary scope of Myers' purview of what should be accounted for in any complete account of human personality. It's a great book, and it should be read. It's still in print. Human Personality and Its Survival of Body Death. It's astonishing to think that it was written in the 1890s and very largely ignored, except by a few exceptional people like William James, who was a friend of Myers.
I think your comment on that matter is very interesting, because I believe the questioner was in fact asking about the reductionist view that everything is due to the failure of bodily processes, and your answer suggests that perhaps the failure of bodily processes in fact liberates or frees the consciousness to experience things which are blocked when the body is functioning normally. That's a very interesting approach, I think, to that question.
There's been several people earlier asking about the issue of the differences in people, either ethnic factors or age factors or whatever, in terms of being sensitive to the concept of apparitions or life after death and so forth. And there is Abraham Maslow. I would recommend that anyone who's interested in this would read Abraham Maslow. He and I and others did a lot of work in this area. We studied, for example, the difference between college students and peak experiences. Peak experiences meaning a feeling of immortality. You might have it with someone you love, and all of a sudden you're on the beach in Narragansett Beach in Rhode Island or something, and you're terribly in love with this woman, and all of a sudden you enter into another realm and you feel eternal. This is the so-called peak experience of immortality, no death. And we spent several years working on this. We found the differences, for example, that college students were more sensitive to these and had more experiences than older individuals. Sorry about that. That children, for example, had more a connection, shall we say, with the spiritual world, which I think other researchers already have known. In fact, you yourself, with your work you did with Indian children and so forth, and their memories from a past life. So there is research, and what I'd recommend, at least to start with, if you're interested in that, it's a book you can get at most bookstores. I think there's also the bookstore right here, the Theosophical Bookstore, is the Maslow's book, Toward a Psychology of Being. It's a paperback, it's not very expensive, and you can get started on that, and it will give you some concept.
I think you're going over here.
Yes, I agree. I think Maslow should be better recognized than he is today among psychologists.
My question is, people who aren't necessarily facing death, but perhaps a major surgical procedure, people who claim to have watched the surgery from above or what have you, can remember conversations between the nurses and the doctors. How would that kind of fit in with these near-death experiences, or some disassociation with a physical body, or a visual or auditory remembrance of something that they perhaps by the scientific community could not have possibly experienced? Have you had any experience with that kind of telling or cases?
Yes, we've had quite a few cases of that sort. People in surgery or being wheeled into the operating room. They have unusual experiences. And one of my colleagues, Bruce Grayson, has studied the case of a man who underwent cardiac surgery, and he said, I was up above and looking down, and the surgeon was flapping his wings, and he went like this. And he seemed like a chicken was about to take off into flight. So Dr. Grayson became curious about this, and he interviewed the patient, of course, and then he looked up the surgeon, and it turned out that the surgeon was, cardiac surgeon was a somewhat impatient man, and he would get scrubbed up, as surgeons should, before the operation. Then he'd become impatient, and his assistants would be, say, opening the patient, but he wouldn't be satisfied, and he'd scrubbed up, he couldn't touch anything, but he would go like this to signal to them what they should be doing. So he did indeed resemble a chicken in flight. We have cases like that, but that one was particularly vivid. Another case that's, in a way, the most impressive of all was published in a book by a friend of mine, Mike Sabum, who has earlier written a book about patients. He's a cardiologist, and he wrote about experiences of cardiac patients who, during a period of unconsciousness, ostensible unconsciousness, would nevertheless describe the equipment that the cardiologist would use, such as defibrillators, of which they could have had no normal knowledge. So the ultimate case of this kind occurred in Arizona, where a neurosurgeon was removing an unusually inaccessible aneurysm, a small protuberance of the artery of the brain, and they froze the patient. That is, lowered the patient's temperature by maybe as much as 20 degrees. Then they tipped the patient up and drained the brain of all blood. And the EEG came flat, And this person was just as dead as could be without being dead. All the usual signs of life were arrested or stopped. She was on a heart pump, and they succeeded in the operation. And afterwards, the patient described certain unusual instruments used by the surgeons and gave details of which she certainly could not have learned normally. That's perhaps the strongest case that opposes the idea that, well, these folks are not really dead, they're just in a low state of somnolence, and they really are capable of watching what's going on anyway.
I hope this is along the same lines, but I'm wondering, what about if, say for instance, people that move into a house, and particularly if it's an older home, and it's possible that people may have died there, and you don't know particularly about any of the dynamic of what went on, but you feel perhaps a presence in the home. Have you done any research, that kind of thing? I don't mean the types of things that are televised, but I mean where you feel the presence of another body in the home or in a room, and yet you can't see a person.
No, I've heard about such cases. Hauntings, they're called. I don't doubt that some of them are quite authentic, but I personally haven't had any experience. But a good many of them have been published, principally by the London Society for Psychical Research.